Hey everyone, Rob here, and today I have another book review for you. This one is for Art of Atari by Tim Lapetino, and it's got a foreword here by Ernest Cline, a fellow Austinite, who is the author of two excellent books, Ready Player One and Armada. If you haven't checked those out, I highly recommend that you do. They're actually both being adapted into major motion pictures. The first one, Ready Player One, I think is already in post-production, and that one's being helmed by Steven Spielberg, so I have high hopes for that one. Although, if you've read that book, and I don't want to get too much into it because we're not doing Ready Player One in this video, but if you've read that book, you know that it might be a licensing nightmare because it has a lot of 80s pop culture in it and a lot of references to video games and movies and music of the time. So we'll see what they're able to get away with when they make that movie. But anyway, it's also got an afterword here by Robert V. Conti, and I had not heard of him before this book. I did look him up, and it looks like he's kind of a pop culture expert and memorabilia guy. He apparently has extensive collections of 80s memorabilia, and I think he's working on a book about Kiss, and he's been an editor and an author of many, many comics, so he's well versed in 80s culture as well. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the book itself. This is a hardcover edition. I don't think there's a softcover edition available yet, but this hardcover edition is actually really nice. It's got a nice thick cardboard cover, and it's got really nice thick pages here and an excellent print job. It's published by Dynamite Entertainment. I had not heard of them before. I did go to their website, and I saw that they actually publish a lot of comics, but not traditional comics. I don't really know what to call them. I guess my way of thinking, they're kind of revivalist comics, not revivalist as in like church revival, but they're reviving a lot of old IPs, stuff like Lone Ranger and Tonto and stuff like that. So if you're interested in kind of cult or niche comics, you may want to check out Dynamite Entertainment. But anyway, the book itself, again, by Tim Lapetino, it covers a lot more than just the artwork of Atari. It goes into the kind of the backstory of Atari for a little bit, the history, how it got started, and how they really developed into one of the first companies that merged design with engineering. So it goes over a lot about that at the beginning. Here's art and design, how they got into coin ops, which was really the first thing that they ever did. And then they got into the home consoles, and it goes all into how they developed the home market and all that other stuff. I don't want to get into details, but the main bulk of this book, the main bulk of this book is the box artwork, and there's a heavy amount of content that's box artwork. But then there's also these artist profiles: Cliff Spohn, Rick. Guidis, I'm not really sure how to say that. Susan Jekyll, Steve Hendricks. All these people had a big hand in creating all this iconic artwork for early Atari games and marketing and advertising, all that stuff. So let's go ahead and just kind of get started here. I'm not going to go into details of the text. Again, this I can tell you right now before I even get too deep into it. I've already read most of it. I highly recommend this book. If you're a fan of video game history at all, or if you're a product like me, a child of the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of this stuff is really going to hit home with you. A lot of the old Atari games, in fact, probably all the old Atari games, had really rudimentary graphics. They were very basic. And in order for you to really get into them, really you only had the manual and the cover art. And you really kind of had to use your imagination to really get whisked away to this other digital world. So these iconic artwork pieces really went a long way, and they really kind of etched themselves into my memory, and I'm sure a bunch of other people's. Just by looking at them, it just instills in you just waves of nostalgia. So here's the foreword by Ernest Cline, and he kind of goes over, he's a big 80s culture and pop culture guy too, and in fact his two novels are littered with that stuff, so it's a good pick for him to have a foreword to this. So this is his foreword there. I'm not going to get too much into that. Tim Lapetino kind of goes over how he decided to create this book, and like Tim, I was also kind of surprised that up until now there was no real history of all this really iconic Atari artwork. Some of the artwork still is anonymous, not anonymous, but we really don't know who did some of this old artwork. A lot of it was lost. Some of it was just, it was just discarded. So he really is working hard to preserve a lot of video game art, and he's actually starting up a video game art museum that I think hasn't fully gotten off the ground. But if you're interested in that, you can check out the the Tim Lapetino. I think it's called MOVA, M-O-V-A. I can't remember the acronym, but it's a museum. Okay, it's a museum of video game art. I think that's what it is. But anyway, he's doing a really great job, and he contacted all these artists, and he got some really good interviews and salvaged a bunch of artwork. So he's doing a good job in preserving our history. And speaking of history, there you go, the birth of Atari. So this kind of is a high-level introduction on how Atari got started. It has a story of Nolan Bushnell, all the engineers that came over from Ampex. Basically, they were just rebels. They were treading new ground. They were trailblazers, and they started this whole industry basically by themselves. This is a picture here of Computer Space, which was the very first coin-operated video game. And it didn't do that well. It did okay, but it was enough to get them started. And they started with a company called Syzygy, but I believe that the trademark was already taken up, so they went with Atari as their second choice, which I think is a much better name than Syzygy. And it goes over kind of their history here. Here's Ted Dabney, who was bought out by Nolan Bushnell for almost nothing. And Nolan Bushnell came out with millions and millions of dollars ahead. There's, I believe, Al Alcorn. Yeah, that's Al Alcorn. He was one of their first engineers, and he developed the game Pong based on instructions from Nolan Bushnell, who had gone to a trade show and seen a Pong type game that was created by Ralph Baer for the Odyssey, the original Odyssey, which was the first video game home console to be released. So there's a whole lot of, early on in the industry, there's a lot of kind of copying back and forth, a lot of stealing of ideas, and, it didn't stop. In fact, Nolan Bushnell stole the idea for Pong, and then Ralph Baer ended up stealing back from Atari the idea for Simon. Ralph Baer not only created the original Odyssey, but he created the Mattel hit game, electronic game Simon. So, and you'll see that a little bit later. So it goes over again the background. It goes over a little bit about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who inadvertently helped Steve Jobs make a whole bunch of money for Atari. Apparently, Steve Jobs wasn't much of an engineer, but he was a hell of a salesman, and he convinced Steve Wozniak to make a breakout game by reducing the number of the chips that were needed to create it, and he got a big bonus and gave Wozniak almost nothing. He lied to Wozniak and said he was sharing the bonus with him evenly, but ended up keeping the lion's share for himself. So there's a whole bunch of kind of backstories like that, and it's a really cool history, and it's very rich, and you should check that out. Again, I don't want to ruin it too much, but it's the part of it's here, and there's other great books that you can read that have to do with video game history. But anyway, moving on to this book. So here's some artwork that comes from a retailer-focused advertisement where they're not necessarily advertising directly to the consumer, but to the buyers and maybe trade magazines and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that in here too. So here's more of the history and the assembly line. Apparently they were so short for help that they were hiring basically anybody with two hands that could get into the assembly line and put stuff together. They were originally manufacturing a lot of these things in Sunnyvale, California before they got moved off to China. So here we talk about art and design, and again, Atari was really at the forefront of merging design with engineering, and you'll see a lot of that later on in this book. But before them, really, you had companies making electronic equipment, and they were just basically just putting out boxes with a bunch of chips inside, and they were functional, but there wasn't much design put into them, and really Atari was the first company, along with Apple, which came later, that really had, again, the DNA design was in its DNA. So they almost from the beginning, from the onset, they had design as a big portion or a big part of their company. So here it goes over some of the artists here and some of the artwork on the covers of these old games. This video music thing, I'm not really sure what it is. I think it's a visualizer for music. I don't really know. I don't know if it was ever released, but Atari, you're going to see throughout this book, really was ahead of its time in a lot of its ideas. They had a holographic video game system. They had a first color portable video game system. They had a VR headset for its Atari Jaguar. I mean, they were really ahead of their time, and sometimes stuff wouldn't even make it out of prototype stages. So there's a lot of cool stuff in here. This is from the pinball era. George Opperman was the artist for this stuff, and you'll see his You know, he really influenced a lot of the early Atari stuff. Unfortunately, he passed away fairly young. He was a chain smoker and died of cancer. So that was unfortunate. But he did, not before he made his imprint on Atari and the art department. So here this goes over the typography, the iconic Atari typography. The font here is used as Harry Fat 60-point font, and you'll see it here on the cartridge covers. Stuff like that. And here's an alternate Bauhaus bold typography. So if you ever want to make anything that looks like it came from Atari, you can use these fonts here. It talks about how the font makes a big difference in marketing and stuff. And here's George Opperman. It's this guy right here. He was basically the heart and soul of the Atari art department for a long time until he passed away. He really was. He was kind of the ringleader. He kept everybody together. He was apparently a very hard worker and essentially worked and smoked himself to death, unfortunately. But so you're championing powerful design, so he had a big hand in Atari's design phase or design centric focus. So, and this is just like an example. Like when you're playing Breakout, you just hit a ball, or not even a ball, a square little dot against this multicolored rainbow bricks. And that's all you do. But George Opperman is taking like, well, let's visualize this as kind of playing a game of tennis. And, you're kind of stretching there. It's not really tennis because you're just hitting against a wall. But they did this type of thing. And sometimes it would include stuff like comic books that came with I remember Yard's Revenge came with a comic book. And it really set the backstory. And every time I played Yard's Revenge, because of that comic book and because of that artwork, it really kind of transported me to another world when I was playing that. And I really appreciated that. So I think if you just got the game cartridges without the artwork, without the comic book, I don't know. I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much. So there's the famed Atari logo here. So I think this is more pinball stuff, I think. Yeah, pinball game. So here's I don't know if this was ever used. This is a photo shoot where it's basically a naked woman, a naked female model in green grease paint. Is that what it's called? Grease paint? Yeah, green grease paint that they were using. These are supposed to be mushrooms. I guess she's supposed to be the little shooter thing. Some of these games, when they were created, there were pretty much one or maybe two men on a project, or a woman sometimes. I think Centipede was actually a man and a woman that created that together. But a lot of especially the home consoles, there were just one person creating them. And there were the designer, there were the programmer, they programmed any music or sound effects. They basically did everything but the actual packaging artwork. So they would communicate to the art department what they figured the game should look like or be depicted as, and the art department would basically instill a backstory to a lot of these games. So you'll get some stuff that's like way off base where like, wait, what? How is this artwork relating to the game whatsoever? But sometimes they hit it on those and sometimes they don't. So here's the logo, the famed Atari logo. They paid $3,000 to George Opperman when he had his independent design company for the Atari logo. And it's worth, this is a story, I like this quote right here. So we had paid $3,000 for the original logo from George, and they spent $100,000 to find out, don't fuck with it. So essentially, when they got bought out by Time Warner, they were maybe thinking about revamping their logo and their image, and they did a whole bunch of research and decided like, oh, this logo is actually very well known. We shouldn't mess with it. So that's kind of funny. Spent $3,000 on the logo, $100,000 to find out they shouldn't mess with it. Coin-op, the coin-op division, that's what was Atari's heart and soul at the beginning. And a lot of the art department folks started in the coin-op division, and they were really limited by the coin-ops because of the type of printing they were doing on the coin-op machines, limited them to the number of colors they could use and the amount of detail that they could print. So you have a lot of that kind of very vague detail and very muted colors. There's a ladybug here trying to get into my picture frame. Get rid of that. This is an interesting game here, or an interesting story behind this game. There's a game called Gotcha. I don't think the game's actually very interesting, but I'm going to redo this little caption here. A photo used in the flyer for the arcade game Gotcha. The game's infamous controls were round, pink, and dome-shaped. You can see them right here. Designed to suggest a woman's breasts. Soon after, arcade cabinets were retrofitted with more standard controllers. So you can see how like inappropriate this would be in 2016. There's no way that this would fly. I mean, this woman's breasts are pretty much hanging out. She's got no bra on. This guy's trying to grab her. I mean, there's all kinds of bad things going on here. Not to mention, the at the forefront are these two giant pink globes meant to represent women's breasts. So pretty crazy times in the 70s. Here's more coin-op stuff. Here's some flyers that. So basically, back then they had all these flyers that were supposed to be attention getters to the coin-op purchasers, mostly the arcade operators or pizza joints or whoever had to buy all these very expensive games. So they made these really cool looking. Look at the art design and some of the stuff. It's really amazing on those arcade flyers. So here's where they start going to the consumer section, and here they finally get into the home consoles. So here's a prototype rendering, or the artistic rendering of the Atari 2600, which was originally the VCS and became the 2600. And here are the different consoles. They actually went past this, but these are the numbered consoles. The 2600, which was originally released as a VCS and later became the 2600 when the 5200 Super System was released. And then later on, they added the 2600 and 5200 to get the 7800, which was the one that was supposed to compete against the Nintendo Entertainment System. Unfortunately, Atari had the chance to publish or to distribute the Nintendo Entertainment System in America. Nintendo actually came to Atari and said, hey, do you want to distribute our system here in America? Atari turned them down because they already had the 7800 in works, and they figured, why are we going to license this when we have our own product? And they turned them down, and the rest of the story. Sad times for Atari. So Atari XE, this was actually a computer that was converted into kind of a console. This is pretty rare. I actually have one of these. It was given to me as a birthday gift a few years ago. I don't think I've ever actually played it, but it's a pretty cool piece of equipment there. All these pastel colors, you can really tell it was dated. This is from 1987, so it's really a product of its time, the design is. Although it still has the iconic joystick, which we'll cover later. 1989, they released Atari Lynx, was the very first color portable, and it blew the Game Boy away in everything but battery life, and of course game library, which is the big one. So that was this could have been a big thing if they had handled it right, but fortunately, like most of Atari's offerings in later in life, they messed it all up. Same thing with the Atari Jaguar. They had a big lead on the PlayStation and Saturn, and they squandered it. So, but such is life. You can't always win them all, right? Here's more artwork for the home computer system, the video computer system. And these are before they had the VCS, before they had the machine that had interchangeable cartridges. They had these dedicated consoles that would play variations of the same game, like several versions of Pong or Stunt Cycle or Video Pinball, and that's all they did. That was before they moved again to the cartridges. This is Touch Me. This is what Ralph Baer ended up copying to create Simon for Mattel. You can even tell it looks very close to Simon. I don't believe that they have the tones, though. That's what Ralph Baer did really well. He did a lot of research and figured out what four tones would be very distinct to human ears, and he used them to associate with colors, to where a lot of people can play Simon without even looking at it, just based on the tone. And I think that this one just had generic beeps. I tried to buy one of these. I found a boxed one on eBay for like $30, and I bid up to like $41, ended up selling for $42. I was kind of sad I missed out on that, but yeah, it was a box. Touch Me. It would have been an interesting piece for my collection, but oh well, such is life. And here's the meat and potatoes, and you can see I use this. It's got this ribbon bookmarker here that's built into the hardcover edition, and I've put it here because this is where the box artwork starts. So a lot of this artwork is, like, again, I use the word iconic a lot, but I think it really is. In fact, a few years ago, I remember, you can see some of the artwork here. I remember that there was parody covers for Atari games where they would take the original images and put a totally different title for the game, for a made-up game that made more sense with the image. Like this one had to do with somebody that was on acid, so it had some kind of clever title that had to do with something on acid. This one, I Dodgem was Oh, I Say was the title of the game, and it had like all these different game variations that had to do with like the early 1900s. So it was pretty fun. All these again are they've been around forever, and I just I can look at some of them and instantly tell, like from the front cover here, like I can just tell from looking at them, just like parts of them, what games they were from. Like I can just look at this guy's head and know immediately that this guy is from Missile Command, and I'm not even like, this is just from memory. This guy's from Warlords. Obviously, this guy's from Centipede. This is from Breakout. It may not be immediately evident, but this is actually from Breakout. You can kind of see the bricks there, and this is from Asteroids. So a lot of these games, they just, the artwork just kind of stuck with you. And a lot of these artists, you'll see that they have similar styles across different covers because, well, artists tend to have their own style. Cliff Spone's one of my favorite. You'll see his artwork here. Susan Jekyll has kind of this whimsical style, this kind of Beatles-esque late 60s, 70s style. Very kind of fun, loving, and kind of almost childlike qualities to it. Rick Guidis, I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, or Rick G. I think he ended up marrying Susan Jekyll. They met at Atari, or maybe they had met prior, but they both worked at Atari at the same time. You can tell this is Cliff Spone as well, and you can see his artwork here. He has kind of a realistic look, and he's one of my favorite artists. Him and Kimura are two guys I really like. Rick G is pretty good too. Here's more Cliff Spone. 8500. I'm not going to go through every page, but just kind of give you an overview here. There's more Cliff Spone. More Cliff Spone. He's very. He's got kind of got this kind of like watercolor and pencil look to it, I think, and he's always kind of got these collage type images where he's able to get a whole bunch of things in on one cover. And something like this is pretty important because there's a whole lot of different things represented in one game program. So he's got different variations of Pong. Really, Video Olympics is just video Pong. There's a whole bunch of different versions of Pong, but there's volleyball represented in hockey and basketball all represented in this cartridge. So he's able to kind of get the feeling of all that in soccer, on one cover. So that's pretty. This is what it actually looks like. This is the cover. This is what I imagine. This is what I get to play. But we didn't know any better. That was the only thing that we had available at the time, so we had a blast with it anyway. So there's more Cliff Spone here. I think there's an artist profile coming up. There it is. So there's an artist profile on Cliff Spone. They have some quotes from him. He's one of my favorites, and he actually did some work for Apple. So this is some work here that for an Apple manual. You can see it's almost the same thing. He's got a lot of the collage thing going, the watercolors, the pencils. Really excellent work by him. I think actually Steve Jobs wanted to hire him away, but he stayed an independent contractor. So more stuff here by Cliff Spone, really good stuff. This one's by Steve Hendricks, and some of these guys used themselves as models. I'm not sure that he looked exactly like that, but I've read some of these guys use themselves as models, or they would use people from around the office. A lot of women around the office were immortalized as part of covers for Atari games, so that's pretty cool. Here's more Rick G stuff, and I think this is Spone just by looking at it. Is it? Yes, it is. So there's Susan Jekyll again. And that guy to me looks just like Jim Plunkett, who wore number 12, but he wore it for the Raiders. That looks like a 49ers color. Apparently, there's a thing here that he put a Atari logo on this guy, and some guy tried to sue him saying that was his likeness and that it wasn't. But I think Jim Plunkett maybe has a case here. Look at this. Look at this flag capture game and the amazing cover for it. That's pretty cool. That's actually a different person altogether. It's John Enright. You'll see that some of the artists appear a lot more often. You'll see a lot of Cliff Spone, and you'll see alternate covers too. Like this is an unused cover art for Home Run, and this is the actual cover art for Home Run. And there's subtle differences, but you can see like pretty much stuck with the same thing. There's some color changes. He moved the player around, and he moved the stadium around so that it wasn't underneath this guy's foot, and this guy wasn't coming out of his crotch, I guess. But you still see very much of the same thing. It's just kind of moved around a bit. And you got to remember also, this is before the digital age, so all this stuff was done by hand. Watercolors, airbrushing, pencils, all that stuff, pastels, all this done by hand. There was no digital coloring back then. So if they wanted to change, they had to make a change and paste it on top or redo the thing from scratch. I know there's Susan Jekyll again. You can definitely tell her style just by looking at it. James Kelly, another guy. There's an Enright again. You can tell that guy's definitely looks like an Outlaw Josie Wales type of guy. That looks like Cliff Spone, but it's not. Okay, so that's Hendricks. Yeah, you can definitely tell product of its time. Look at these cool 70s retro future images here. Retro future cars. This is when they had licensed Superman. This was an unused piece of artwork for Superman, which has the traffic in reverse. Has the London style coming at you from the right and going away on your left, which is kind of interesting. That's Christopher Reeve, of course. And you can tell, this is the cover, again, it's so iconic. This is the cover for Adventure. And immediately you can tell Susan Jekyll did this. I don't even have to look. I didn't look that up before. I just know this is a Susan Jekyll type of thing. And here it is here. Yep, Susan Jekyll. So, and you can see here, he has photos of actual box art. It's not like he's got the original artwork for a bunch of this stuff. Sometimes he does. Probably this one's an original. But a lot of stuff is just lost. So he's hunted down, and I like how he left the price on there. 31.95 in the early 80s was like double that. So, and you have to remember that uh, games were very new back then. So you didn't get nowadays you can get games for, when you're on sale, you can get a whole bunch of games. Back then, you bought a game, it was like a big deal until the crash, of course. Then you could buy games for $3 or $4 at your local drugstore in a bin when they're trying to get rid of them. So more artwork here. You can see some damage here on this box art. All right, so you kind of get the idea. Here's a Rig G profile here. More retro future stuff. There's the Oh, I Say Dodgem cover. Who did that one? James Kelly. So, oh, here's a really cool one. These are the ones where like they used models from. You can tell like this lady went to work one day at Atari, and they're like, "Hey, Susan or Jenny or whatever her name is, pose for me. I'm gonna put you on a cover of Defender again." No, obviously Star Wars, right? This is a Star Destroyer, right? But this is for Defender. I just know. I haven't even, okay, so it says Defender there, but I just know by looking at this, it's for Defender. This is for Centipede. And it's funny because in Centipede, and this is for Centipede as well, in Centipede, it's just a little shooter guy. It looks like a snake to me, but apparently it's an elf. They visualized it as an elf with a magic wand shooting at this happy-go-lucky centipede. So this is Hiro Kimura, and he's one of my favorite artists. That he did a lot of different covers. So anyway, Defender. Here's an interesting thing. This was done by Hiro Kimura as well, and the original artwork was this right here, and they took it to Steven Spielberg, and he said, Elliot needs to not be so angry. He needs to be more worried. So they gave him. He went back and he adjusted it, and he created this worried look, which is the one that made it onto the actual cover of the game. So that's pretty interesting. There's a whole lot of that backstory. Here's the Unearthing a Mystery. Okay, so this is where there for a long time there's an urban legend that Atari had made so many ET cartridges that they couldn't sell them all, and rather than keep them in storage, they decided to just put them in a dump in Alamogordo, New Mexico. So they there's this team of people that went out and documented unearthing these cartridges, and it turns out it was true. It was buried under layers of concrete. The guy that was in charge of the landfill back in the day apparently had done a very good job of documenting where stuff was put underground, and he had a map of where he thought they should be, and after a couple of days of digging, they actually unearthed all these cartridges. There's actually a pretty cool documentary on it. You can find it on Netflix, and I think Xbox. Microsoft actually sponsored this documentary, even though it's for Atari stuff, for Atari games. But check out the documentary. It's really cool. All right, so more. I like this one. This one was supposed to be the original cover, but the eyes are unacceptable where they are currently placed, so it ended up being inside the manual. That's pretty funny. I like all this alternate artwork. So there's another Hiro Kimura. Hiro Kimura, to me, it looks like all this stuff looks like album covers, like 70s album covers. There's another Kimura one, like that one there. Look at this one. This one's pretty amazing. This is supposed to be Pac-Man, right? And the way he's visualized it is pretty crazy. These ghosts, look at them. Those are the ghosts that are after Pac-Man. I have never visualized Pac-Man in this manner, and that's pretty cool. And here he is making it right here. He's actually painting it, and apparently he was like, what? Okay, so he was 80% finished when management asked me to change the direction. They became concerned the ghosts in it were too ferocious, which I kind of agree. I mean, look at those ghosts. I mean, no wonder Pac-Man's running for his life. But look at the detail in this artwork. It's pretty amazing. This guy is really good. So here's another, this Pac Kid kind of concept that he has. So here's unused cover art and final cover art. I don't know. He looks like he's kind of baked here. He's kind of wasted, right? Anyway, some cool stuff. Here's where they licensed Pac-Man. Probably one of their most successful, if not the most successful game for the 2600. Some more cover art for Phoenix and Kix. So Raiders of the Lost Ark, etc., etc. So again, I don't want to get stuck doing all this stuff. Is there anything cool in here that I want to talk about? So here's Hiro Kimura's profile. He's working on that ghost thing again. Oh, here's one of my favorite covers. This is Yar's Revenge. This I feel is like a perfect album cover, and this is the game that came with the comic book. That was really, it was one of the I think it might have been the first one that I remember that came with the comic book. There might have been others. I think there were, but after I read the comic book and then played the game, like it totally changed my perspective of how I think I would have played the game without it. So pretty cool. More artist profiles, and then towards the end, there's a whole lot of artwork, right? Towards the end, they start to talk about the hardware a little bit more, a lot of prototypes, the process I just saw. So one cool thing, all right, so here's industrial design. So one cool thing, that was an internal memo I saw over here, that I want to talk about was this iconic controller. Again, iconic, right? So this controller, you can show it to even my kids, right? And they will know that that means a video game. That is like the iconic 80s video game. This is retro. If you show anybody a silhouette of this joystick, they know exactly what you're talking about. And the funny thing is, this joystick wasn't even designed for the Atari VCS. It was designed for this thing. This thing was a Tank 2 home console that was meant to play a game called Tank 2. And there were modular joysticks that were meant to fit into this console and be used like tank controls. That's why they have this military look to them, this kind of the north, south, east, west look to them, and kind of those little dots here. And this boot here, this rubber boot, was put in because the guy thought it looked very military-like, which it does. And he was kind of surprised when they took that concept or that design and used it as the basis for the Atari 2600 controller, because he thought, this wasn't even really designed to be used as, controllers outside of the console. They were modular. They just fit in there and use them like that. If I would have known, this is the designer talking, if I would have known that they were going to use this as, standalone controllers you hold in your hand, I would have designed them completely differently. But, well, they persevered. Here's some of the earlier controller concepts that they had. I don't know what happened to that. If you look at here, they have smaller cartridges, and there was originally a plan to put a little area in the console itself where you could store your cartridges, which I thought would have been pretty neat. But anyway, yeah, pretty cool story about that. They discuss it here. This is one of the worst controllers ever made, the Atari 5200 controller, or the CX52. It was a non-centering stick. That was basically the death knell for that thing, because it had that rubber boot, which kind of centered it, but it didn't have a centering spring. So if you were playing something like Pac-Man, you push it to the right and you let it go, it stayed to the right. It didn't recenter. And it was a big problem with action games that required very precise control. So that was a big part of its failure. 7800 just came out at the bad time. Atari 400 and 800 were actually pretty successful computers at the time, personal computers. The 400, if you notice, has a membrane keyboard, more meant for kids and families. And this was meant more, it looks like an electronic typewriter or electric typewriter. It was more meant for office use and more business use and meant to look more professional. So, and that all goes into the, the industrial design. Here's where they got kind of some ideas from the stereo equipment of the day. Here it talks about the process, all this cool stuff. There's a bunch of memos going back and forth, more designer profiles. And here's some prototypes, really cool stuff that never came to be. Here's that Tank 2 console I was talking about with those modular joysticks that ended up being the main joysticks for the Atari VCS. Here's a handheld Breakout and Space Invaders, in the Tank 2 console. So a wireless Atari 2600 called the Atari 2700, which I don't believe ever saw the light of day. Pretty cool looking though. The MindLink, I mean, talk about, we haven't even gotten this far. They were way ahead of their time. This thing was supposed to be a controller where it would allow you to control the games with your mind. I don't know that ever worked, but it's pretty crazy that they put any kind of research into it at all. I mean, this is like the early 80s, so pretty cool stuff. A lot of this stuff did eventually make it, the visualization for music, we put into like Winamp and Apple, and, a bunch of people did that. But that's pretty cool. This is a holographic, the Cosmos. As far as I know, Al Alcorn actually completed this Cosmos machine. It was a portable hologram video game player. And it was really cool in concept. I don't want to get into the technical details, but I was able to reproduce holographic images on these games. It was kind of like a backdrop, but that thing apparently just came out at a bad time, and they couldn't they couldn't get it. They couldn't get it into production. The cartridge is supposed to be very cheap. Look right here. We could retail the game cartridge for less than $10, but yeah, they couldn't get it together for some reason. 1981. We still don't have a holographic. I mean, we had the what was it called? The Nintendo. Oh my God, the 3D thing. I can't remember now. I want to call it the Vectrex, but it's not that. But anyway, we still don't have a holographic. I know I'm going to remember. So when you write in the comments that I can't remember the stupid Nintendo 3D, the red one, oh my God, it's killing me. It's killing me. I know what it is. Okay, so don't put in the comics that I'm an idiot because I can't remember the name. I'm just blanking out for some reason. Anyway, going back to the book here. This is a pretty cool thing. Key Games was actually a company that was. It was pretty cool because Nolan Bushnell, when he created the arcade, the coin-op division of Atari, the original division, he found out that there was distributors that would only work. They kind of had exclusive agreements with certain manufacturers. So if you wanted your game distributed by a different manufacturer, you couldn't because you had a deal with one distributor. So what he did is he created a rival company called Key Games, where he put one of his top dogs in charge of this other company. And it seemed like that guy had splintered off from Atari and, decided to create his own company. And what happened is Key Games ended up making a partnership with the other distributor, and then Atari ended up re-merging with Key Games, essentially giving them access to both distributors. So in essence, he kind of circumvented the distributor monopoly on our coin-op games, which is very clever by him. So anyway, this is a Key Games version of the Atari VCS that never came out, which is basically just orange. Here's Atari Jaguar VR. If you have a PlayStation VR, but that came, what, 20 years later, something like that. I'm sure this wasn't anywhere near as good as the PlayStation VR and the Oculus Rift and the Vive are right now, but still, it's pretty cool that they even had this at this time. And here we have some advertising and promos. Some of the stuff is aimed at the retailers. Look at this thing. Atari trackball announcement shirt worn by female booth reps, promoting the new controller at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1982. This is, again, like how sexist it was in the late 70s and early 80s. Get your hands on Atari trackball, and it's got them right over their tits. Isn't that pretty crazy? Really crazy. Different times. So yeah, these were the Atari catalogs that were included in many of the Atari games, and it kind of showed you the different games that were available by Atari. And some cool Atari. That's a pretty cool trucker hat. Atari Force was a comic book, a short-lived comic book published by DC. And here we go, the afterword by Robert V. Conti. I believe that this, I read it. I think this just goes over his Christmas with the Atari VCS and his kind of childhood with the Atari. So it's a pretty cool read too. Anyway, that is Art of Atari by Tim Lapetino. I highly recommend this book. You can get it on Amazon for pretty cheap. I had a $10 off coupon for any book, and I ended up getting it for $19.95. But I've seen it range from $25 to $30 without any kind of coupon or anything like that. So highly recommend you pick this up. There's also an accompanying book that's a poster book, and that one I believe, I don't own that one. I think it's a softcover book that just has posters of the Atari artwork and nothing else. It doesn't really have the interviews or profiles. It's a little bit cheaper, but if you're just interested in purely the artwork, you may want to look into that book. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, as always, leave them in the comment section below. Or you can send me a tweet at Rob Nava, or you can look me up on Facebook at the same name. If you enjoyed this video or like any of my videos, please consider subscribing or just clicking that little like button there and let me know you like it. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and see you soon.